Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Kai had never been the kind of man to be easily swayed by power or threats, but that didn't mean he was immune to the weight of emotional debt. He carried his gratitude like a quiet, unshakable burden, especially toward Drew, the man who had not only funded his experimental surgery but had unknowingly given him a new lease on life. The procedure had been risky, teetering on the edge of science and desperation, but for Kai, it had worked. He could walk again, run again, hold a football without the pain screaming through his bones. For a young man whose dreams had once been shattered under the weight of injury, Drew wasn't just a benefactor, he was salvation. Kai owed him everything, and that sense of obligation burned like an oath in his blood, an allegiance forged in silence and stitched into every step he now took. But things became complicated in a way Kai had not anticipated. One late afternoon, Trina, someone he had grown close to, someone who had trusted him, confided in him, caught between her turmoil over her parents' strained marriage and the burden of knowing too much. It was a quiet conversation, laced with the kind of vulnerability that only exists between friends. Trina mentioned that Curtis, her father, was secretly trying to track down Jacinda and had plans to offer her a substantial amount of money in exchange for changing her statement, altering the truth behind the ketamine scandal and making it appear that Drew had been responsible for his own drugging. Trina hadn't meant to reveal it, not truly. Her voice trembled not with accusation, but with fear and conflict. It was clear she didn't want to be involved, didn't want anyone else involved either. She expected Kai to keep it buried, to let it go. But Kai couldn't. That quiet oath to Drew surged forward like a tidal wave, threatening to drown his friendship with Trina in the name of loyalty. Inside Kai, a storm began to brew. The emotional debt to Drew warred with the fragile trust Trina had placed in him. He told himself it was about justice, about doing the right thing, about standing up for someone who had saved him when no one else had. But he knew, deep down, this was a betrayal, one cloaked in noble intentions, but a betrayal nonetheless. He couldn't let Curtis get to Jacinda first. He couldn't allow the truth to be rewritten just to protect Portia or salvage a marriage built on layers of deceit. Kai chose Drew. And in doing so, he chose to break Trina. He didn't hesitate. There was no warning, no subtle test of conscience. He went to Drew with the kind of controlled expression that masked 1,000 contradictions. His voice steady, his words sharp, Kai laid it all out. The entire plot Curtis had discussed with Portia, the lengths they were willing to go to coerce Jacinda into changing her story, and how Trina had inadvertently confirmed it. He didn't flinch when Drew's eyes narrowed in disbelief or when the full weight of what he had just confessed settled in the room like dust after a demolition. Drew listened in silence, processing the betrayal, the manipulation, and the danger of being framed as a man who had willingly self-administered a dangerous sedative. He had suspected Portia, perhaps even Nina, but Trina's involvement, even as an unwilling pawn, shocked him to the core. Still, there was no time for outrage or reflection. Action had to be immediate. Drew moved swiftly. With Curtis already in pursuit of Jacinda, Drew mobilized his contacts to find her first. The chase became a race against time, where the prize was not just the truth, but reputation, legacy, and the unraveling of a web of deceit spun by people once trusted. But Curtis, now aware that Drew was a step ahead, acted recklessly. Blinded by desperation and rage, he followed a false lead into a remote area outside of town without backup, without caution, driven by the need to protect Portia's name and keep Trina from discovering the full extent of his collusion. In his haste, he ignored signs of danger and walked into a trap, whether laid by fate or by his own poor judgment, no one could say. The resulting accident was severe. Curtis was found unconscious, barely clinging to life, rushed to the hospital in critical condition. The headlines would speak of the tragedy, of the unforeseen twist of fate, but the truth was more layered, more painful. As Curtis lay in the ICU, surrounded by the hum of machines and the sterile scent of antiseptic, Trina stood at his bedside, paralyzed by grief and betrayal. Slowly, pieces began to fall into place. She had trusted Kai. She had opened herself to him, shown him a vulnerable side rarely seen. And he had used that moment, not just to gain insight, but to weaponize her fears. When she finally confronted him, she didn't scream or demand answers. The silence between them was heavier than any accusation. Her eyes told him everything, her heartbreak, her fury, her disbelief. Kai tried to speak, to explain that he did it for the greater good, that he had no choice. But Trina turned away, not because she couldn't forgive him, but because she no longer recognized him. In the days that followed, the consequences of Kai's decision rippled outward. Drew's search for Jacinda intensified. Portia found herself under scrutiny as legal pressure mounted regarding her role in the ketamine scandal. Nina's panic escalated as she realized her web of lies was unraveling faster than she could control. And Kai, once a young man with a second chance and a debt of honor, now walked the halls of General Hospital as a ghost of his former self. He had chosen his path, and though it was paved with conviction, it was stained with the blood of friendship, trust, and the kind of innocence that never returns once broken. For Kai, there was no easy redemption. Loyalty had a price, and he had paid it in full, only to discover that the currency was much more personal than he ever expected. Trina could hardly believe what had happened. It was as if someone had reached into her chest and drained the very blood from her heart, leaving behind only a cold, hollow ache that pulsed with betrayal. The sting of what Kai had done didn't just come from the information he had shared with Drew, it came from the brutal way he had twisted her moment of vulnerability into a weapon. She had trusted him. She had opened up to him, not as a strategist, not as someone maneuvering through agendas, but as a daughter desperate for understanding, a young woman caught between two fractured parents and her own quiet despair. She had confided in him with the expectation of empathy, with the assumption that he would protect the sanctity of her words. But instead, he had used them, weaponized her fears, her uncertainties, and exposed her father's desperation not to shield her, but to further Drew's cause. Trina didn't care if Kai had done it out of a sense of duty, out of moral obligation, or to repay some spiritual debt to the man who had given him his future back. To her, none of that mattered. What Kai had done was a betrayal of the highest order, one that cut far deeper than anything she had ever experienced. And for that, there was no forgiveness. She didn't confront Kai with shouts or accusations. Instead, she stood in silence at her father's hospital bedside, her eyes locked on the very man who had fractured her trust. There were no words spoken between them, but the message in her expression was unmistakable. Her gaze was frigid, a wall of ice built from shattered trust and burning disappointment. The rhythmic beeping of machines filled the room, sterile and soulless, replacing what should have been the comforting sound of her father's breath. Curtis lay motionless, bruised, and broken, and Trina knew in her soul that he wouldn't be there if Kai had stayed silent. She didn't need an explanation. She didn't want one. As far as she was concerned, no justification would ever be enough. Still, Kai tried. He stood in the shadowed corner of the ICU, trying to piece together words that might somehow soften the edges of what he'd done. He spoke of loyalty, of responsibility, of a truth that needed to be preserved before it was erased. He insisted that if Drew had been framed, if the world was being manipulated to make him appear unstable, reckless, and unfit, then someone had to act, someone had to stop it. But to Trina, those arguments rang hollow. What good was the truth if it demanded this kind of price? What worth did integrity hold if it left her father bleeding, unconscious, and barely clinging to life? For Trina, there was no noble cause that could excuse sacrificing someone she loved at the altar of someone else's redemption. Kai had made a choice, and in doing so, he had chosen Drew over her, over the fragile trust they had nurtured, over a friendship she had once believed might be real. While the machines in Curtis's room continued their quiet vigil, the world outside spun into motion. Drew, having secured the full extent of Kai's confession and pieced together the larger conspiracy involving Portia and Nina, wasted no time in acting. Now with Curtis sidelined, taken out of play by the very consequences of his own desperation, Drew held the upper hand. He departed Port Charles under the cover of night, boarding a plane for the rugged outlands of Australia where Jacinda was believed to be in hiding. No longer constrained by the race against Curtis, Drew had time, leverage, and the full weight of his resources. He reached out to contacts in Canberra and Melbourne, stirred up political favors, and pulled strings through old connections from his time abroad, all to ensure that Jacinda would speak to him first. The truth, for so long buried under layers of manipulation and fear, was now within reach. Back home, the fallout was just beginning to take root. Portia, reeling from Curtis's condition and drowning in guilt, faced mounting scrutiny. Questions began to surface within the hospital board regarding her possible tampering with medical records and her role in shielding Curtis from exposure. Rumors rippled through every hallway, and what began as quiet suspicion rapidly evolved into a formal internal investigation. Portia, who had once believed she could control the damage, now found herself losing everything. Her reputation, her authority, her husband. Each minute that passed without Curtis regaining consciousness added to the weight of her culpability. Meanwhile, Nina's panic bloomed into full-blown fear. For months, she had maneuvered through every obstacle with precision, building a narrative designed to destroy Drew's credibility and secure her own ambitions. She had buried allies, silenced dissent, and trusted that her web of manipulation was strong enough to hold. But now, that web was unraveling. Kai's testimony had added a crucial piece to Drew's puzzle, and with it, he had begun constructing a case not just against Portia and Curtis, but against Nina herself. For all her cunning, Nina had underestimated Drew's resolve and the extent of the loyalty he inspired in others. Now, the very scheme she had orchestrated had become her undoing. Her name, once whispered in circles of influence and prestige, was now being muttered with suspicion and disgust. And at the center of it all stood Trina, abandoned by trust, wrecked by sorrow, and consumed by the realization that everyone she thought she could count on had their own version of righteousness. In the stillness of that hospital room, with her father's hand lifeless in hers, she realized the cost of truth was often paid not by those who demanded it, but by those left in its wake. There were no heroes here. Only casualties, only fragments of a life shattered by ambition, vengeance, and the mistaken belief that loyalty justified everything. Amid the relentless chaos unfolding around him, Kai found himself caught once more in the same unbearable tension that had haunted him since the moment he made his choice. He walked the corridors of General Hospital like a shadow, present, breathing, moving, but fundamentally changed. He could feel the eyes on him. Some curious, some judging, some simply confused by the silence that had wrapped itself around him like armor. But the only gaze that mattered, the one that once met his with warmth and trust, was now averted, colder than any punishment he could have imagined. Kai knew he could never return to what he had with Trina. The bridge between them wasn't just burned, it had been reduced to ashes by the flame of betrayal he himself had ignited. There was no apology vast enough to rebuild it, no justification strong enough to mend the wound he had carved across her heart. And yet, Kai wasn't filled with regret. There was sorrow, yes, an aching melancholy that lingered in his chest like an old scar, but not regret. In the deepest corners of his mind, where doubt and conviction coexisted in uneasy harmony, Kai clung to one belief with unwavering grip, that he had stood on the side of the truth. That when it mattered most, when silence could have preserved his friendships but destroyed another man's life, he chose to speak. He told himself, over and over, that Drew's name deserved to be cleared, that allowing Curtis and Portia to manipulate Jacinda would have been a greater sin than betraying Trina's confidence. That truth mattered more than personal comfort, more than sentiment, more than fear. It was this conviction, this cold, fragile certainty, that allowed him to look in the mirror every morning and not flinch at the reflection staring back. He didn't see a traitor. He didn't see a coward. He saw a man who had paid for his honesty with loneliness and silence, and still believed the cost was worth it. But for Trina, that cost was impossible to reconcile. Sitting beside her father's bed, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her back stiff from hours of unbroken stillness, she felt 1,000 emotions wage war inside her. Grief, exhaustion, anger, confusion, and an aching question that refused to leave her alone. Was it worth it? Was it worth trusting someone that deeply? Was it ever worth handing your soul to another person, only to have them turn it into leverage? In Kai, she had seen someone she could rely on, someone who existed outside the swirl of her family's dysfunction, someone steady in a world where everything else seemed to crack and crumble. And yet, when it came down to a moment of choice, he had not chosen her. He had not even hesitated. That reality was harder to bear than the machines beeping steadily beside her or the motionless form of her father lying under a white sheet that couldn't shield him from the consequences of everything that had gone wrong. Trina's world had changed in an instant, not because someone had lied, but because someone had told the truth in a way that disregarded everything human about it. She now questioned everything, every look, every word, every promise ever made. Because in the aftermath, it was clear that the currency of loyalty was never love or understanding, but leverage, debt, and self-preservation. She wondered if goodness still had a place in a world like this, where secrets were measured in dollar signs, where friends turned into informants the moment their ideals were challenged, and where every whispered vow could be swallowed whole by something as intangible and yet as devastating as a moral obligation. What good was morality if it dismantled everything else in its path? Kai, on his part, knew he couldn't reach Trina anymore. Not through words, not through gestures, not through time. The version of her that had once laughed at his jokes, leaned on him when her parents fought, and confided in him about her dreams was now a ghost he could never summon again. That loss stayed with him, quiet and steady, not as punishment but as truth. And yet he carried it. He carried it the way soldiers carry the weight of survival after war, grateful to be alive, but forever marked by what it cost them. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't seek redemption. All he wanted was to live with the knowledge that he had chosen to protect what he believed was right, even if it meant becoming the villain in someone else's story. And so, Kai and Trina remained on opposite sides of a wound neither of them could close. One clung to truth as a lifeline, the other mourned the trust it destroyed. Neither could say who was truly right or wrong, only that everything had changed. And that sometimes, in the battle between truth and loyalty, no one wins. As the dust of deception slowly settled over Port Charles, what remained wasn't resolution, but a haunting silence, an uneasy truce between those who had acted, those who had suffered, and those who would never be the same. Drew, emboldened by the truth Kai delivered and the evidence he had meticulously compiled, finally reached Jacinda. She told her story, not to rewrite the past but to reclaim her place in it, confirming that she had been pressured, cornered, nearly bought. With her sworn statement, Drew stood on the brink of redemption. His name, once smeared with rumors of self-destruction, began its slow restoration, and the house of lies built by Portia and Nina began to fracture under the weight of exposed intentions. Curtis, meanwhile, remained unconscious, suspended in a liminal space between life and death. His accident had become more than just a personal tragedy, it had become a symbol of what happens when ambition and desperation eclipse reason. Portia, stripped of her authority and dignity, found herself under internal review, her world crumbling piece by piece as every decision she made was held under a microscope she could no longer control. Nina's influence waned, her schemes unraveling faster than she could pivot, her name now uttered with caution, disdain, or fear depending on the room she entered. But it was Kai and Trina whose story remained the most quietly devastating. They did not meet again, not truly. They crossed paths in sterile hallways, passed each other in silence, and occasionally shared a glance that said everything they never would. Kai carried the ache of a friendship lost, a loyalty fulfilled at too high a cost. Trina bore the scar of betrayal etched into her chest, the knowledge that even the purest bonds could shatter under the weight of secrets. She stopped asking if he regretted it, because the answer no longer mattered. And Kai stopped hoping for forgiveness, because he knew he didn't deserve it, not from her. In the end, the truth had surfaced, but it had not saved them. It had not healed the wounds or restored what was broken. It had merely revealed how fragile everything had always been. Port Charles moved forward, as it always did, leaving behind the wreckage of another storm. And somewhere within it, two souls walked alone, one anchored by the belief he had done the right thing, the other haunted by the knowledge that sometimes, doing the right thing meant losing everything that once made it worth it.